Long, long ago, in ancient days, pyramids rose and palaces fell. Let's venture back into the past and to the present time. Farewell.
Amazing. I can't believe how amazing that read was. Also, I love the passive voice in Pyramids Rose and Palaces Fell.
I mean, it's better than Ancient Aliens.
Welcome back to Deep in Bear Country, a Berenstain Bear cast. I am your host, Phil Gonzalez, and would you like to go back in time? I sure would. Would you like to go back in time with the Berenstain Bears? Sure, why not? I mean, I guess it's not something they tend to do a lot of, but we are in a weird, we're in a weird section of Berenstain Bear history where Mike is sort of experimenting with the format, I guess. We've already gone around the world and seen that Italians wear striped shirts and ride in gondolas, and that French people sip espressos at their cafes with their pinky sticking out. Let's find out what happens when we go back in time. However, I am totally unqualified to talk about anything historical, although you'd be, it would be okay if you thought I was, because I tend to pretend to know what I'm talking about on this show. But I was like, hey, why not bring on a historian, or an historian, I guess is the proper way to say it? I don't know, actually. Is it a or an?
I don't know. I think that's why I introduced myself as archaeologist first, because one, alphabetical, and
Okay.
it's an and before that.
It's an and before archaeologist. Let's stick with that. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, Dan Everton, archaeologist and historian in New England. He's currently finishing his master's degree in public humanities, focusing on museum studies, and he has just been accepted into the University of Manchester's Egyptology master's program. So he'll probably know a little bit something about that boat we see them driving around in this book. Welcome to the show, Dan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. This is actually kind of like, how many years have we been friends? And then finally, I'm now asked.
It's been years. It's been
It's
yeah.
I actually talked to a mutual friend of ours, and they looked at my old profile because spoiler alert for your fans, I have a secret Facebook because
Yes.
Facebook likes to hate me. And my old one, and it was like 6 years, and I was like, oh, that's probably as long as Phil and I have
Yeah. Yeah.
Facebook.
I do remember you making the realization that I was the same Phil Gonzalez as the Berenstain Bears Phil Gonzalez.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was a hot moment of like the worlds collided, and I don't know why I didn't realize that,
Hmm.
but yeah.
I think it's both because most people have a very different idea of what I look like in their heads. Like they're like,
Mm, mm.
guy who talks about Berenstain Bears by himself in a room somewhere. I don't know. Maybe he's, I don't know, more slovenly, I guess. I don't know what people think I'm going to look like.
No, you do sound like a Hank Green type,
Oh, well, yeah. I mean,
tall,
yeah.
like you're tall, skinny.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And big glasses.
yeah, yep.
I tend to go for the big glasses in my life. That's always been my thing. I saw John Flansburgh and They Might Be Giants years ago, and I was like, I want those glasses. I want to be the glasses guy. And so
Nice.
that's how I went. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Hi. It's very exciting to talk to you. You've been, as you said, a part of my online life for a long time. I've sort of watched your journey through your education as a historian, archaeologist. Watch your interests, wax and wane, grow, and just you sort of building on your expertise. And once upon a time, you said, I have to have you on the show if I ever want to talk about communism. But now it's like grown into like a whole bunch of other like interests.
Yes. I mean, still we could talk about communism, but but which you know what, Berenstain Bears still not willing to take that hot take, but
Yeah, they're probably not gonna jump into that for, I don't know, maybe when Mike retires and he writes those boutique books he's been threatening to write.
mm. Yeah, I think we knew each other too when I was an EMT, and everyone thought that, especially my family, thought I was totally going to go the medicine route, and I was like, you know what, actually, I might want to go in debt and just dig things up.
So what's
Which
the
is what the
what's
book does.
yeah, what's the benefit of like of being of archaeology, of history? Like
Okay,
give me your sales pitch.
the reason why my family doesn't disown me more than it does, so the benefits of history and archaeology, I mean, One, to quote some historian too who mentioned this, but I forget their name, is like, we are kind of repeating history a lot. And I think if we learned from past mistakes, we would probably cease to do them. However, historians are nary ever listened to, except on the History Channel. And the History Channel is always about two things, World War II and aliens. So
Right.
we get nothing of substance from there. But for archaeology, it is very prescient, not just because of laws currently today. Like as you know, I work with NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves and Protections Act, and so repatriating human remains is a very big topic because people kind of realized, oh wait, it's been 30 something years since this law has been passed and nothing has been done.
Hmm.
Um, and it's been revitalized and because every so often laws have to be looked at again, I guess. And there's a new deadline, and there are many, many museums, unfortunately, that have remains of ancestors that should rightfully go back to their homes and homelands. And then there are remains that won't because, like for example, with Egyptology, ancient Egyptian remains are not really in demand to be repatriated. It's mostly royal remains. If there was a royal, like Ramesses the first or second, I forget, was repatriated to Egypt back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think Anwar Sadat was still in power then or whatever, or he was still the minister or something. Um, but yeah, those remains can't go back. So like, what do we do with them? And that's kind of what I do is like looking at how do we respectfully care and maintain these very precious people that are unfortunately have to live in a museum where we usually think of things as just being art or statues.
Right.
And and so I think it's that. And so it's like both an ethical thing, but also in a practical sense. Field archaeologists today, because land is ever expanding, um, most archaeologists in the field in America at least are like, oh, we have to go build a building. We want to make sure there's nothing there, both, archaeological or crime scene. That's also
Right.
something so that you have archaeologists go dig, do a preliminary assessment, and then like at least in Massachusetts, where I'm from, spoiler, um, uh, it's mostly expansion, especially. So like
Mm.
they actually just completed a recent dig, and so now they had to remove everything from that spot. It is a destructive science as it is historically, and now they're building a highway over the site of a village. So we're active, but honestly, probably behind the scenes more than anything.
Right. What do you do about curses? You ever encounter curses?
So, I mean, I make curses myself,
Okay. Okay, good.
but I do secretly hope that if I die, I mean, okay, I will die. Everyone dies. If I die, I'd like the people that have to go through my home will accidentally pick up something that is cursed,
Hmm.
and in a very Jumanji like shenanigans ensues kind of thing. Um, but but no, like I've never actually had to deal with like, oh, this item might be cursed or whatever,
Right.
or like honestly, the oldest thing I've ever held was like, people are always like, oh, what's the oldest thing you ever held? And they imagine like buried treasure, like the Berenstain Bears, and I'm like, no, it was a giant red pot, and
Yeah.
it was over 8,000 years old. Like it was
And I
over
think
8,000 years old.
I think most people don't realize just how old some of the rocks they touch on a day-to-day basis are.
Oh yeah. And like it is kind of funny because I don't have to take geology classes as an archaeologist, but like there are some like intersections obviously. And someone was like, "Yeah, do you know like how old that rock is?" And in Massachusetts we have a thing called pudding rock and it kind of looks like weird melted pudding, like
Hmm.
someone just put like plopped it there. And it's like bajillion years old. It's like
Yeah.
from like ice ages. And I'm like, and it's just standing here, like right now. Um, and they're like, yeah, so like if you hit it, like just like, no, you're probably not gonna find anything else.
Right. uh, well, the Berenstain Bears certainly find something else. And this week's book is The Berenstain Bears Long, Long Ago from 2018. And I mean, it's, as you said, it starts off with some digging. So,
This is actually a very typical scene, and unfortunately, I have always it's either, people with the little metal detector or
Mhm.
literally going around with a shovel. And so in their backyard, no harm, no foul, I guess. The three kids are out digging, and then they find an old is it a dump truck? Like
Yeah.
yeah, a dump truck, if you will. And they're like, "Oh, it's treasure." And like now they have been bitten a little bit with the Indiana Jones gene, as I like to
Hmm.
call it, and then they start digging more. And for some reason they found a plastic bowl, which you know what, in the future, like 1,000 years from now, archaeologists then will dig something and find something like our Tupperware or something, because plastic will never age. um,
Right.
and so it did have a little bit of like a oh god moment, but they kind of were assuming a lot of things about the quote unquote artifacts, if we want to call them.
Yeah.
And of course, they go show them to the parents, and the parents were like, "Oh, I forgot this guy." So they were like, "Papa, very prescient because he's always reading." Said I was reading in the newspaper that Professor Actual Factual is digging up these things from the past near his museum, and I was like, "Wow, okay, he owns a museum, and his name is Professor Actual Factual."
So, Actual Factual is the owner and curator and only scientist who works for the Bearsonian Museum. He literally runs the astronomy department, the archaeology department, the paleontology program. Everything is run by this one guy. He is the neighborhood scientist. I am
How
curious
much?
about the fact that they found a bowl and a hammer and a truck that were lost in the backyard, but seem to be like several feet down.
Mhm. So, a fun fact, because I was like, I made a point to be like, tell Phil this. Um, you actually do not have to dig that far, especially in the New England area or areas where there's a lot of agriculture, because the soil has been turned.
Okay.
In my dig when I went into field school, so like how do you become an archaeologist? You can just get a bachelor's in pretty much anything. There are bachelors in archaeology, but really the what's prescient is like the are important is the field school. So you actually going out, doing digging, doing this kind of stuff. And we went 50 centimeters and got to things that were from the 900s.
Wow.
So like that's not far. And most pits are a meter deep. And you're in like, older, like ancient times.
Well, I
Um,
think what happened is these kids buried these things while playing, and now they're trying to get
to
around the fact that they buried Papa's hammer about a year ago.
one, and also who buries a bowl? I think they maybe stole some berries.
Mm,
And maybe we're hiding the evidence. Or,
yeah.
I mean, it doesn't look like a pie dish, but like it would have been probably funnier if it was a pie dish, and it would make sense that maybe Papa stole said pie, had to get rid of evidence, buried it in the backyard real quickly.
Now I'm picturing Papa with like a bowl full of like pizza dough or pie dough, sitting in the backyard in the middle of the night,
Yes.
like shoveling it in and being like, oh, and like burying it. And then years later, Mama's like, this is that bowl I lost.
Yes.
Also, all that dough I lost. Papa's like, oh, wow, archaeology. Let's go to the museum and talk to Actual Factual.
Yeah, so actual factual like takes them to an active dig, which you can actually go. There are some spots in the National Park Service where like it's public archaeology, so we try and get people interested in archaeology, where it's like, hey, look at us doing hard physical labor, and you get
Yeah.
to make jokes about if we're finding dinosaurs or not. That is a common misconception. A lot of people confuse me for a paleontologist and ask if I'm looking for dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Um, but I have not found any dinosaurs, and yeah.
But I mean, have you ever come across fossils? Like,
Um,
fossils exist.
yes, they do. The closest would be I found animal remains. So like we
Mm,
found remains of like pigs and stuff like that were we suspected that there was a famine year, and these very young animals were killed probably for their meat, and that's unusual. Like, usually you wait until a cow or a pig kind of gets a little fatter and bigger and older to use it. It's like that's the kind of stuff that as archaeologists we kind of look at and be like, huh, what inferences we can make from that. Kind of
yeah.
like what the kids were doing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, which I probably am, but like a big part of archaeology is looking for like trash, like
Yes. It's
stuff people have
basically
disposed
trash.
of,
Oh yeah,
because
it's
that's how
basically
we know.
trash.
That's how we know about people is kind of what they used
Mhm.
and threw away.
Yes, that is accurate because I think a lot of people do think that like it's a Pompeii situation where everything is just like there. And and that's not true because the most abandoned sites are truthfully abandoned. And what's left over is their trash, and we try to make inferences from that trash. My favorite is that like in old time New England, like Puritans and Pilgrims did just like the tradition was just to toss your trash on the back window. So like you can find out where the back window of the house is if you start finding trash.
That's awesome.
And and you can find things like pipe stems and like broken pottery because like if a dish was broken, they were just like, well, there it is.
Yeah. They didn't make nice little mosaics in their backyard, little
No,
walkways leading to
no,
their patios.
it was a lot of weird brick and this like it's like this patchy thatch stuff that they would use to make their roofs too, but they also would put it between bricks. And oh, there was nice glass. For like back then the windows were diamond shaped.
Hmm.
Uh and so I we got some like the wrought iron in that, and also the glass, the actual pieces of like pretty big pieces of glass that are
Wow.
like they were actually surprisingly like pretty see-through. I was impressed. I was like, this is from the 1600s and it's like fairly good glass.
Wow. Now, a little tip for our listeners: you can learn a lot about your neighbors also by going through their trash.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And you know what? The cops do that too.
Hey, yeah, once it's out on the sidewalk,
Yep.
it's legally anyone's.
And like cops, we do have like basically investigations. We're making context from people's trash.
Right. And I think, as you said people go into the Indiana Jones mode thinking they're hunting for
Hmm.
treasure. But yeah, like what's fascinating is the day-to-day people who didn't have treasure. They had
Yeah.
stuff. And I don't know, I think the stuff is far more interesting than a lot of what the kings owned.
And it's because like I think a lot of people do think like say Tutankhamun, because we're gonna get into ancient Egypt, like um none of it was really used. Like that's just for show. Like
Right.
it's really hard to like accurately say. And also same thing with their walls and their tombs. Like it's the best, like if you want to write a book about yourself, you're gonna say the most impressive things about yourself.
Yeah.
uh like how honest can that be? And people are
Right.
like, oh, this is telling us everything. And it's
Well, it's also like when art historians are like, no, the portraits you see aren't even what these people wore for fancy dress things. Like, this is what they
hmm
wore for this portrait because they wanted to look like the most extreme they could and show off all their finery. They weren't wearing this to the ball. That's too heavy. Like, this is what they wanted us to think their lives were like in the future. And yeah, yeah.
they weren't always sitting on a horse with a sword.
I mean, maybe
It'd
there
be a
was
good
one
flex.
person.
It'd be a
Yeah.
fun flex. There's John.
Wow.
He's coming up.
Yeah.
Damn, he's on that damn horse again.
Alan hasn't gotten off that horse in weeks.
Uh,
All right, so they go to the dig, and yeah, there's
mhm,
bears aplenty. They're brushing, they're digging, they got their trowels and their wheelbarrows, and they're working pretty hard.
mhm. Like that is a pretty fairly typical dig scene where like, it's a giant pit. There's sectioned off quarters. People are working. There's wheelbarrows. So I actually did appreciate the sort of almost true nature of it. I was like, oh, they actually at least looked at a like a National Geographic or something.
Yeah, Mike is a stickler for details like this. He loves drawing technical stuff,
Mm.
so I can see where he's like, "Oh, I want to draw an archaeology dig." And also, it's that thing where I think it's important to point out that I can't remember who said it, but it was like if you dig something up and you pull it up into the sky, you've immediately compromised the scene. Like if you haven't
Yes.
marked where you found it, if you haven't like mapped things out, then it's kind of useless as because you've contaminated the evidence. And
And this is why archaeology likes to say that we're a science, because we do those things. Like
yeah.
we measure, we have things, we have context, etc. And like this is fairly new. Like this is
Mm.
like 1900s is kind of when we started figuring this out. So like as you and but the field of archaeology, if we want to call it a field or history of it, has been happening since the 1600s. So like a span of time of people digging stuff up. And then we're like, how about we standardize it? Like, how about we like not just go willy-nilly?
Because for a long time it was like a hobby of like
Yes.
the rich. Like I have the
Hmm.
time and the drive and the desire to go dig stuff up on my land,
Hmm.
and so you would, and then you'd put it in your showroom and be like, look at all
And
this cool stuff I found.
or go overseas and go like the tours of Egypt from England. Like Howard Carter
Yeah.
is actually not an Egyptologist. He's never had a higher degree at all, but he is considered an Egyptologist for some reason.
Right.
Um and he was just basically a tech. He was kind of doing like what field school students do, which is like you are the one digging and you're learning how to dig. And and maybe he was doing some pretty drawings because he actually was an artist as well. And was like, "Hey, I'll sponsor you to go along on my son's dig and you can go off and do that." And you bring everything back that you found.
And
And
then you have mummy unwrapping parties, and then people
yes,
start eating them, which was the weirdest thing that people ever did, I think.
which honestly, people were eating them as early as the 1000s,
Yeah, yeah.
possibly as like a weird, like, oh, hey, could this be a tonic of some sort? Because again, people were finding mummies very early on, and also like the debate of at least with the Ottoman Empire of like, is this is like these are pagans? Do we care? Like,
Right.
that's always been the discussion too. And so like a lot of people were kind of like, we don't care.
Yeah, I was driving in the car with Mitzi the other day, and I mentioned the eating of mummies, and she was like, "The what now?" And so I did the thing where I pushed the button, and I was like, "Hey Google, why did people eat mummies?" Not expecting it to like answer my question because usually it can't tell me anything. But it was like, well, and so we were just driving down the road, and like the synthesized voices sort of explaining the history of mummy consumption. It was
There is a theory too that they used ground up mummy to make pigment for paint. Like so there is a color called mummy brown. It's still, I think, debated if that was
yeah.
possible, but there is I do know for a fact there is a mummy brown in because like other fun fact, I'm a gay. So like all things design and color is like fascinating to me.
Uh-huh.
And there is a long history over years of time of like people just doing paint swatches essentially. And I love those colors and just looking through them. And funnily enough, archaeology also has a whole paint swatch thing of soil color.
Now I want a kids book series that's a spin-off of Encyclopedia Brown about his gay younger brother
Hmm.
named Mummy Brown, who's
Mummy
like the
brown.
archaeologist and fashion expert in the
Yes.
neighborhood. He's like, no, you're gonna want to go talk to Mummy Brown. He's gonna be able to answer most of those questions.
I will only go into the field looking good. I I specifically buy clothes to look cohesive, like a unit, while there are other people who are like still wearing a tie-dye shirt that they've had since the 90s on their first dig, and I'm like strolling in with like nice monochromatic theme or like and
Hey,
everything. Yes,
Sam Neill changed the face of
he did.
archaeology fashion in 1994. So
Yes, yes, he did.
that neckerchief.
Hmm.
All right. So we're not even halfway through this book, and we haven't even gotten inside the Hall of History.
Oh yes. And I love the museum setup like the he has like a which I think many museums do have it. This is definitely an anthropological museum if I have to say.
Hmm.
It is very much most museums of history if, like that's a big like clue of like oh this is an anthropological take of history rather than an art history.
Hmm.
So like this scene that like they set up a little like I also wonder is those are those wax figure bears or are those actual bear actors in this scene which is like an old-timey 100 years ago like that's so far away and they're listening to like a gramophone, yeah, a
Right.
gramophone, an old-timey phone with the little handle and the speaker separate and I guess a Tiffany glass lamp if you will, and there's a two people just sitting there in old-timey clothes and again I do wonder like because museums and their wax figures are something that disturbs me to this day. um but in the idea that in the Berenstain world there is someone who's making these wax figures, it excites me.
Oh, we know who's making them because we've done the book, The Berenstain Bears in the Wax Museum, where we know I can't remember her name now, Madam something, who runs the Wax Museum. So
That
they
is,
probably commissioned her.
they probably did.
Fascinating that what's also funny is this is 100 years ago. The
Yeah.
Berenstain Bears has been around for over 60 years. So what we're
Hmm.
looking at is a setup
Essentially,
that's not far removed from when this series started.
yeah, like this is essentially maybe like the 20s. Like
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
like and so like the idea that like for some reason we have the 20s in a museum is kind of laughable, but I think it is also trying to be like young kids, their sense of time is like nothing. Uh
Well, we have this in a museum in the Institute of Arts near where in Minneapolis. They have these rooms set up where you look and there's no wax figures, but they've done their best to recreate living spaces from various points in history, various geographical locations around the world world. So you can sort of, so you not only get to see what it looks like, but you get a sense of depth and
Mm.
texture, which I think is fascinating. Like, not only is this what it looked like, but you got to get a sense of the weight of like, what does old furniture feel like? And you can look at it. So I appreciate I appreciate actual factuals like adherence to the verisimilitude of this.
I think the
Uh,
Tenement Museum in New York does that
mm,
too. I think like I don't know how far apart they go, but I do think like it like again that old couch feel and
yeah.
whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
way we lived is kind of an interesting thing for me. But not only is this a science museum, not only is this place dedicated to showing you what the past looked like, we've got secrets in the attic.
Yeah, we have actual factuals, I guess layer, if we want to call it
Yep,
that, where he makes weird science projects and in a very, I forgot what that classic novel was about the time machine.
I think it's called
Uh
the Time Machine.
oh, it is called the time machine.
The
Okay.
Time Machine.
Yeah. It that like this gave me that vibe
Uh,
immediately.
because actual factual has not only a time machine, well, he has essentially a TARDIS. It can go anywhere in
Yes.
time and anywhere in space, which for our listeners, this is a clue, a tip off that we are not in actual Berenstain Bears continuity here. There is a weird continuity of Berenstain Bears where actual factual can take them on trips through time, space, and geography where that and one of the tip offs is that as we will see in later on in this book, they're not in actual bear country here. The words America do appear in this book, which sets it in another continuity because we don't hear the words America said in mainline Berenstain Bears world. That's not the name of their nation. So I find this fascinating.
Is it fair to say like suddenly we're in an alternate reality of our own reality that
Mm-hmm.
happens to also be adjacent to the Berenstain Bears world because there are bears
Mm-hmm.
in this world
Right.
or and I'm positing this theory this is all actual factuals like intermakings like this is not even reality. I think this is his imagined world and so that he's not in a way grifting but yeah like in a way he's grifting them all.
Are you suggesting that actual factual has created some sort of a holodeck?
Yes, I am
Okay.
indeed. I am indeed. He is doing the thing on the next generation ship like that one place where you had the sad scene with the whales in the movie. That
Yes.
that.
He is fooling us. I mean, honestly though, if my museum had this, I fool me. This would be a great this
Yes.
would be a great journey. Except we're about to see world history through the eyes of a, shall we say, very Eurocentric bear.
Yes. Especially when like first facts all the bears are the same color. One.
Which
I'm
which
just gonna go with the elephant in the room.
So this is one of the fascinating things about Bear World, which is the fact that there's no race in Bear
Mhm,
World. All the bears look the same. Like they literally look the same. They are
mhm,
indistinguishable to our human eyes. They
mhm.
are indistinguishable from one another, be it in low like their ethnicity, their gender, their anything. Like the only indications we have about where they are from, how they identify gender wise, is their clothing, basically,
Yes.
because
And their name or their titles or names like
right. We know that pandas exist. We've seen
mhm,
there's a panda family in the neighborhood. We know that polar bears exist because we've heard reference to them.
mhm.
But we've never seen polar bears in the bear world. So as far as there's no racial identifiers in bear world. So it is all sort of this sort of almost superficial signifiers how they choose to present themselves, which makes world history fascinating in the
Yes.
bear universe.
Um, and so we start off like apparently where everyone wants to go, which is ancient Egypt, and we have a cute Nile scene.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the pyramids of Giza, which is like the big thing, and the Sphinx. The Sphinx does notably have a suspiciously bear-like face.
Yes.
Um, and then I think that's the Temple of Karnak that they're also trying to allude to, which is like a whole other section of the Nile, but that's fine.
I
And
appreciate the fact that the pyramids are shown with their gold caps.
yep, the Ben Bens.
Yep. And they don't look like, usually in old children's books when you go back in time to the pyramids, they look like like the pyramids
Yes.
today.
Yeah. And they would have been this color, this white limestone. However, the one on the left, because this is also too like geographically tricky. The one on the far left would have also had like a line of red at the
Mm,
bottom because he wanted to be fancy. I think that's Copper's pyramid. Fun fact. So like the other two, so the big pyramid, we all know that one. That was the biggest.
yeah.
However, the second one, while smaller, is set higher on
Mm.
the plateaus because this is all built on like weird little plateaus. It's set higher on the plateaus, so it by trick of the eye looks like it's taller. That was definitely a move in particular.
Yeah.
Historically, ancient Egyptians like to one up each other that in building things. That was their goal. And the Nile boat looks pretty like, yeah, okay. And then of course Papa Bear gets afraid of the idea of mummies.
Of course. That's okay. So, first of all, this says 4,500 years ago. Now, when people think ancient Egypt, it's generally presented in the pop culture as maybe a 100-year period. Like, let's go
Yes.
to ancient Egypt. But what we think of as ancient Egypt covers a huge period of time.
Huge. Honestly, people were like Homo sapiens sapiens were there like around the Nile area because it was also like it was ocean at the time too. There was evidence in their deserts like you find whale bones.
Mm,
So at one point it was either fully underwater or mostly water. Um, 15,000 years ago. And like the earliest records like so the big pots that I was talking about, the early signs of like civilization, like quote unquote, what we call civilization, which is like people are making things and people are staying around longer or something. Is these big, if you go to a museum, and you see the big red and black pots, so they're like black on the top and red on the bottom. Sometimes they're flipped on color too. Those are the oldest records of pots, which are about 7,000 to 4,000-ish years old.
okay.
And so this is before the time of like what we would call kings and pharaohs. So that's the pre-dynastic, if you will.
Yeah.
So this time it's like a bunch of people randomly hanging out as clans or whatever, probably fighting each other. There's probably already a concept of religion because we have evidence of like the whole Osiris and Isis and everything like that already being there when we have the first king, quote unquote, aka the Scorpion King. Uh, not the Rock, but
Oh,
like
come on.
I do pretend that it is The Rock. So
But
like,
but as people are fond of pointing out, like as the meme says, like
mhm,
Cleopatra lived closer to the creation of the iPhone than to the creation of the pyramids.
which is exactly true.
Yeah.
Because the pyramids were built in the Old Kingdom times. So like we now fast forward a little bit from now we're forming kings, and then the Old Kingdom was like the most richest ancient Egypt has ever been, and it's mostly because the king has the most control. The king is definitely viewed as like a second god essentially,
Yeah.
or little god, if you will. For what some of his titles are called. And like they were able to afford to make these giant monuments because they had enough of control of it. And like this would have been probably 3,000-ish years old compared to Cleopatra. So like
Yeah.
it's kind of it is in a way like us looking at let's see.
I don't even
I
know if
guess
we
like
have
looking at
anything
the
that old.
like Grand Canyon, maybe. Like
Yeah.
even though it's natural formation, but like that's pretty much what she would be looking at the pyramids at. Like, oh wow, these are so
Yeah.
old.
Look at these old things.
Mhm. And,
Uh
and and the pharaohs did frequently go back to these pyramids and like try to connect themselves to the kings of the past as kind of like one legitimizing their lineage or whatever, even though they were not at all related to these
right.
people that
And
are in
also
there.
then the Greeks came in, right?
Yes. Yep, the
Like
Greeks came in. That's why Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is with the Ptolemies. Alexander the Great. So like the Persians were ruling at the time, and the Persians were apparently very dicks. Like, uh, they how they controlled was definitely apparently more martial law, as a colony because they were treating Egypt as a colony essentially. And of course Alexander the Great famously didn't like the Persians and was like, "We're just going everywhere and wrecking house."
yeah.
And so apparently like the Egyptians at the time were like, great, we want the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Mm.
So like here's Alexander the Great. Alexander claimed himself as Pharaoh and did the very like Pharaoh is almost kind of gender in and of itself where it's like it's a performance where okay, I have to adopt this type of dress, and then I have to adopt these kind of names, and then I have to do these little performances that every other pharaoh has done. And that's also why we have women, female pharaohs too. Like they just did the same things of like,
Yeah.
well, I do this dress and I do this and all that. And so, and then that's how we started having a Greek line of pharaohs, Alexander the Great. And then he was like, "Hey, general, I'm going back home. You take care of this." And so Ptolemy became the next pharaoh,
Yeah.
and then subsequently all his kids, descendants afterward too.
Right. It's a long history.
Yes.
You might say you could study the history of Egypt and
It's
get a
almost like
degree
you
in it.
can. I know,
Yeah.
right?
There's a lot to learn.
And
More than you can cover in a 2-page spread in a Berenstain Bears book.
exactly. And they did try, which is cute. Like, and then they did go segue into Greek, which is kind of funny because like I think that's how we're taught in American school system. I think a lot of people think that this is so separate or whatever. But like by the time we have like Aristotle and Plato and everything like that, we had Confucius
Yeah.
and we also had pharaohs doing stuff too. And it almost feels like disparate parts of and like I think people don't realize that they were all happening concurrently.
Right. I find that fascinating. Like when you study like Mayan history
hmm
and you realize what is happening, we're presented with the idea of here is ancient things,
hmm
but these ancient things are happening at different points on the timeline, whereas there's industrial revolutions going on here while these
hmm
people are discovering like just metal in the first
Yeah,
place. And you're like, oh wait, this is all happening at the same time, and if they all ran into each other, it would be like this total culture shock for everyone.
which is kind of funny because like the Mediterranean, they were aware of each other like
Yeah.
way early on, and that's why we see like Greek Mycenaean art type styles in some pharaoh palaces because they thought it was cute, and they liked it, and so like there's definitely trade going all around there,
Yeah.
and so like then so when we hard segue into this trireme, that's the boat that we're
Yeah.
looking at. I do like how they were great sailors, yes, and were powered by oars as well as sails. They did kind of try to show that like it's a bunch of dudes who have to push this damn thing.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I do like how they give let's see, it's 2,400 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say also older. I think there's evidence of triremes being older. I think this would put us around you know the Spartan movie, like
Okay.
with the Battle of Thermopylae and whatnot. So this is again Persians versus Greeks, age old time. And I think that's where they're putting us, which is like again a very popular time to study. Everyone likes the Battle of Thermopylae for some reason. And they like the Spartans too because they feel that it's exotic compared to like the Athenians, which is like
Right.
kind of how the victors wanted it to seem.
Now, historically, do you know if happy dolphins tended to swim along with these boats?
Honestly, probably.
Good.
Like there's references of dolphin, and also too, like in the Mycenaean culture, so like the Mycenaeans were basically Greeks before Greeks became like a fully formed, like here we are kind of thing. They were again disparate clans that were kind of also competing with each other. But there's always depictions of dolphins on their walls. So like happy dolphins is a theme.
Good.
And I wouldn't be surprised if like that was a good thing and also fun and probably I mean it happens occasionally now, but like this is again ancient times. We're not fucking with the waterways that much. Uh most of it is like closer waterways where dyes are affecting things, but this is ocean. I think there are way more happy dolphins wanting to fly around. Yeah.
That's awesome. As a historian, I hope you point out frequently that if there's one thing that has stuck with us through all of human history, it's the desire to see happy dolphins.
Yes. Um, and animals, like at least in ancient Egypt, I do have a whole digital exhibit dedicated to people putting their dogs on their tombs
That's
and like on
awesome.
their wall art. And it is frequent.
I love the old lists of dog names, the like that people called their dogs.
Back in the actually to bring this back to the ancient Egypt thing, there is a dog buried in the mortuary complex at the Pyramid of Giza, and he was specifically buried because he protected the king, and
Hmm.
he's like specifically called out of being like this dog's a good dog.
That's awesome. So yeah, I love that. So as wild as it is to try to do a let's explore the world history with the Berenstain Bears, I do know that Mike is he's well read. He's
Hmm.
well he loves history. He loves studying this. There's a reason he wants to do a book like this. He loves to draw ships. He loves to draw animals,
Hmm.
and this is kind of him stretching his any reason not to just draw another like town square.
Yes. And he is definitely like the architecture, like it is definitely calling to this is these time periods. And he's definitely probably enjoying that flex.
Yes.
Though now we're in Rome. And
Yes.
at least we have mention of one Italy and then also slaves.
Yes. So
And
2,000 years ago. Yes.
yes, 2000 years ago, which is probably accurate. I mean, I think that like pitting people against each other to fight is like probably even as old, like older than when we were so like quote unquote in a civilization times. Like I think people just liked seeing people fight, and
Hmm.
there's possible evidence of like there's always people trying to screw another person over, and like now you're a slave.
Right.
And it gets worse, of course, once we get into like fully formed societies.
Right.
And being and the Colosseum, no one wants to be there. No one wants to be there. No one wants to do this. It's very sad for both human and animals,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
And when you say no one wants to be there, the bear family doesn't want to
The
be there.
No, no,
Actual
they look
factual is like,
uncomfortable.
yeah, actual factual is saying like, the Romans loved fighting so much they made their slaves fight to the death as
Yes,
gladiators. And he's like, look how fascinating this is. And you see the bear family like cringing away, sisters covering her
yes,
eyes. And I'm like, yeah, this would be blood-soaked sand at this
yes.
point.
This would not be fun. I also like the fact that the guy has a pitchfork and a net. So
Mm-hmm.
like we know his mission or his goal is to probably stab and also capture.
Right.
And also like we can see evidence of the bears around being like booing or cheering, which again
Yes.
is such a again like I think he's both both drawn and written like this dichotomy of like this is disgusting and disturbing, but also
Right.
he's just like cheerfully being like, and yeah.
Now, what's fascinating is I haven't released the episode yet, but I've recorded the episode on the Berenstain Bears We Love the Library. And in it, you
Nice.
discover that Brother Bear loves stories that are set in the past, specifically
Ooh.
stories about battles and warriors and specifically siege engines. He loves siege engines.
Hmm.
And it shows a bunch of illustrations like this of bears fighting each other with swords. And I like to think that maybe when he goes back home, Brother won't be so keen to like
Mm,
drool over the violence of the past now that he's
I
seen
agree.
gladiators actually fighting in the Colosseum.
He's been scarred by like, oh no, this is what the reality of war is. And
Yeah, it's kind of
yeah,
like if a kid loves like war and then you show him like the beginning of Saving Private Ryan and you're like,
yes.
"This is war, kiddo. This is what it looks like." And just being like, "Oh, maybe I'll go back to the fairy tales."
Maybe he'll stick with historical romances instead.
Maybe. We do find out in that book that Sister loves space grizzlies and stories about science fiction in space, like
That's
flipping
cool.
the gender ideal on its head. Because
That is pretty neat.
yeah,
Do they
so
have do they have like Trekkie bears?
they definitely well, we know they have Bear Trek that
Okay.
exists. So I don't know if they have cons, but they probably do.
Mm.
So yeah, so we a hop, skip, and a jump from ancient Rome. uh,
We're kind of still following the fall through with Rome. They talk about the Roman Empire and then
yep.
like fighting barbarians, which is definitely like an allusion to Vikings, I think, is what he's trying to go for. And
Barbarians is an interesting choice of words.
it is like, and that's the thing too, is like there's actually a whole class about this at Brown that I have not taken, but it's like that's the word that Romans used or Latin word that like was used for anyone who's basically not them. So we're talking about like Visigoths, Vikings, Britons, Anglo-Saxons, Celts. So like everyone else in Europe that was like not near them were considered barbarians, essentially. Uh,
Yeah. Is the term I don't know if you know this, but is the term barbarian in any way related to the word that became bear?
ooh, I wonder.
I
Ooh.
know that like well maybe not. I know that berserker is
Berserker is, and that is specifically Germanic.
Right. So probably not. It's probably
Probably
just a
not. I think
yeah.
I know Brune. So I speak Portuguese, which is also a Latin language, but it's also a Celtic language. So we tend to mix things together, unlike some of the other Romance languages. Brune is brown,
Yeah. So maybe
and
not.
Bruno is, I think, the bear. So I don't think
Right.
so. I don't think so.
Yeah. One of those just coincidences. Uh
Oh, I wonder if
yeah.
they would call themselves the Bruni. Like that's what they would call the Roman bears would call themselves the Bruni
See,
instead of the
I find it
Romani.
one of the things I find fascinating about studying the Berenstain Bears and their concept of world history is as you know, history the development of history, the path of history is decided by geography, it's decided by, like by
Mhm,
cultures, and it's decided by language.
mhm,
Like language doesn't develop in a vacuum. It has to be. So if you're like in the bear world, if this word exists or this name exists, then by reasoning you have to say, well, this history had to have followed in order
mhm,
for this
mhm.
word to arrive here. So just the fact that they name certain things certain ways means that certain things had to have happened in history, which is why when you get into American history
Mhm.
in Bear World, it's fascinating because they are not explicit, but they imply over and over again that there was no slave trade.
Yeah.
There was no chattel slavery, as I should say, because clearly
Mhm,
there are slaves in ancient Rome, but there's no chattel slavery from Africa in
mhm.
in Bear World, which means that the history of Bear World happens in a very different way after a point.
And I do wonder, and maybe you did mention this at some point because it's tickling my brain. Like, do we know for a fact that like, oh yeah, they're speaking English, or is this book translated to us in English because they're speaking a different language?
Right, like the Lord of the Rings. Like we're getting
Yes,
like
yes, yeah.
a clunky translation of a non-existent language. I
Mhm.
believe they're speaking English mostly
Okay.
because we get hints that we know that England exists.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
so if it's not English per se, it's their equivalent to English.
Mhm.
So like a language that started in that area and now became sort of the globally dominant language in the last like 75 or 80 years.
Which like now segueing into England, like we go from 1500 years ago to now 900 years ago, and we're having like the basically a Renaissance fair.
Yes.
But I like how I mean, Papa Bear actually looks like he's enjoying it. Mama Bear is kind of like, but
Yeah.
the kids are really enjoying it. But these things were as bloody as the Colosseum. Like that's why I'm
Yes.
also kind of confused as to like why is this okay? Like they're literally gonna stab each other. Like this is the
Right.
thing.
Unless it's a show, like they do the like they would do the like the show battles in
Mm-hmm.
like the time that it's not necessarily to the death. I do want to say that they call that the 1500 years ago they call the Dark Ages.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this period 900 years ago they call the Middle Ages. And is they say
Is
this
it? Yeah.
terrible time has been called the Dark Ages, but I thought Dark Ages was a term that referred to sources. Like it's dark because we don't have as many like written sources.
Yes and no. It's Dark Ages. So like that's true in terms of like so the Greeks did have a Dark Age. So like when Homer was around, like and
Mm-hmm.
that's like again during the Mycenaean era, we have very little written sources because their language got lost at some point and art stagnated and like there's just pockets again that archaeologists can't find.
Right.
And so that's why Homer is technically an oral history because he was just talking about this stuff. It wasn't written down until like later. Um, but similarly, like broadly Europe or like what we call like kind of like modern times, Dark Ages, similarly the same kind of thing happened. Like the language was monopolized by growing religious pockets. We start having plagues, we start having like basically big natural disasters too. So like Dark Ages is kind of actually something that happens several different areas and also several different time periods.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, we consider the let's see, like is it 900 to like 1200, 1300 or whatever is like our dark age essentially, and by our it is the very again Eurocentric, like
Right.
somehow we have a legacy tied back to Europe, and that was our dark ages. And it was like again the times of plagues, a lot of times of like war too, the Crusades, etc., like just ongoing times of war, even though like war was happening in the medieval times too. uh it was
Right.
actually pretty localized as opposed to
Yeah.
being like, oh, everyone's having a bad time.
Yeah, and you said Eurocentric. This is, of course, the Bears are visiting world history in a very isolated pocket geographically. We're not getting Africa like below Egypt.
Yes.
We're not
Yeah.
getting South America. We're not getting Asia at all. This
No.
is just touching. And as you said, those are cultures that this part of the world was in contact with. Like
Yes.
there were merchants and traders and people exchanging ideas and goods all over at this
Hmm.
point. I mean, granted, like as you said, plagues and stuff would put a halt to that for a while, but it would start up. Like the roads were there.
And I do wonder too if if it's also we call it the Dark Ages as a very Eurocentric technique because of the Ottoman Empire. So
Okay.
like Portugal was for hundreds of years was part of the Ottoman Empire. That's why we have that Islamic influence, both architecturally but also words wise too. We have a lot of Arabic loan words and we have a lot of names like Fatima. Fatima is a very popular Portuguese name, at least in the islands where my family's from. And also cuisine too. So
Mm.
long standing history of that. And I do wonder if in a way the Catholic Church, always the big villain in Europe, is like somehow partially responsible being like, well, all those Muslims were here, and that's why we call it the Dark Ages, I
Oh.
think.
Hmm.
I do wonder if that's also a part of it too, but
Yeah.
like if it's both a political but also actual reality of like again these a lot of chaos was happening, a lot of death because of plagues and whatnot, and also the monopolization of like who's in charge, and
Yeah.
also who like is it religion or is it these kings, and then suddenly it's really the church.
Right. Yeah. Startling lack of mention of the Catholic Church in this book.
You know
Uh,
what? Startling, especially when we get into the Renaissance. So we're
right.
now fast forward 500 years ago, and they're
Yes.
definitely alluding to the Sistine Chapel.
Exactly. They are in the Sistine Chapel.
Yes, and for some reason they're allowed in to like just
Right.
observe, which is kind of a weird concept in of itself. But
Do you appreciate the strategically placed actual factual in that scene?
oh yes, oh yes,
So
yes,
we have God touching the hand of God touching the hand of man, the famous illustration, as we know that
he's buff.
yeah, and we know that this is a famous nude
Hmm.
in the art world, where we have and I think that Mike has captured the expression on
Yes,
the bear's face
yes.
that very well. That sort of in the actual painting, like the human face is drawn very sort of relaxed and
Hmm.
not put off, but also he's also spread legged, like in the actual
Yes,
illustration. So we have actual factual in this Austin Powers esque, like I'm just gonna cover with my
yes.
body the crotch area of our famous painting. But it also looks a lot more comfortable to paint this picture than it was in real life.
Yes, yes, because it was historic. He was upside down, like almost upside down. Like he was just
Yeah.
laying on his back doing this, which you know what actually kind of would be kind of comfortable, but you're so high up.
But
Like,
we also know that from his writings, Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, we know that he was in pain. Like a lot of
yes,
he wrote in his journals, he was like, "I hate this so much. This is the worst job I've ever gotten in my
I
life."
think there was theory that he had like a chronic illness or something like a fibromyalgia, if you will, or
Yeah,
whatever. And also too, like he was also doing statue works. Like honestly, cutting marble is not a joke, and also cutting
yeah,
marble that finely, which is like Greeks and Romans did it too. And you would see moments. You can fun fact: if you ever see a Greek statue where there are holes drilled into it to show the beard, that's because the drill was just invented and they were like, we're putting it on everything, we're doing it on everything, just as a quick little one, I know the skill, and then two, I have a drill. So
right.
so whenever new tech came out, there was always people wanting to show that tech, which is
and
very
also,
indicative of today.
And also, whenever anyone says, again, posts a meme that's like, this is what art used to be like, where's this
Yes.
art now? I'm like, these people weren't doing it just for kicks. Like, they
No.
weren't just guys with a bunch of marble. They were being paid to do this by very rich people.
Yes, or the state itself. And
Yes.
and also too you had 12 hours of daylight. You were
Mhm.
using those 12 hours. This wasn't like, oh, I have a 9 to 5, I clock out.
Right.
Like a lot of people, like when they look at textiles from back then, they're like, they think I'm lying, and this is also why I have to fight against ancient alien people, because they're like, this is fake. This is fake artifacts. You're showing me something that was like made today. And I'm like, no, it is that fine because you're literally in a building with an open top, so you get all the sunlight, and you're just working 12 hours of the day. That's
Yeah.
what you just do as a free person. Like
Right.
like not as a slave, but as a free person. Like that's your job.
We
That's
had
how you get
work
your
ethics
brain.
back then. There were
That's
no
like
podcasts back then.
we complain about just go get a job, and I'm like, if you're like literally your food and sustenance portion was determined by your work. Famously, again, I'm sorry that I'm segueing back into ancient Egypt. There were so many strikes because
Mm,
Pharaoh was not giving them their rations. It puts modern strikes to like to shame, basically.
yeah.
Like and that's the thing too. There was such a high stake of like you were supposed to give me grain so I can go make bread, which is full of sand anyway, but I'm gonna eat it.
Yeah.
Um, and you haven't paid up in 2 weeks. We're literally just gonna destroy everything.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Which also gives lie to the idea that these were just. There's this concept of there was pharaoh or there was king, and then there were a bunch of just workers, disorganized workers.
yes.
And it's like, no, we know that there were contractors, there were employees,
Hmm.
these were massive undertakings that were not just done by a bunch of menial, like, just slave laborers.
Well, the thing is actually, and this is actually, you actually bring a great point. Like, slave labor was also, like, as we know, at least with chattel slavery today, skilled workers were always in demand. So, this
Mm,
idea that I'm going to somehow have someone I can work for free to do that same labor, but no, I want someone who I have to pay to do that same labor,
right.
you're going to choose the free. And so like when we say like, oh, who built the pyramids? Was it the slaves? I actually think my theory, which some people also prescribe of like, it's a mix of both because
Mm,
also, but they also like to say when these big constructions are going on, or if there's a big quarry or whatever, they basically make a little village to live
yeah.
there. And they were like, oh, well, they were put in such lavish tents and everything like that and had such lavish fares. I was like, well, if I was Pharaoh and this is the richest time that I am in, I'm going to flex. Like, I'm not going to put them in a motel. I'm putting them in a Ritz-Carlton. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And so even his slaves, like, are treated so good. But slave labor was also skilled work as well. Like, I don't think that there was like, because even freed people were expected to do like again you're gonna pull everything
Yeah.
like you're pulling everything on tiny little essentially like they would put a log roll put another log roll put
Yeah.
another log roll.
Sure would be nice if we had an alternate to this.
Yes,
They're thinking to themselves.
yes.
I guess the point I'm trying to
Mhm,
clarify
mhm,
is
mhm.
that humans have been good thinkers and planners and organizers, and industry has existed for a
Yes.
long time.
Oh yes,
The
yes.
people back then were pretty much the people we are now. Like
Hmm.
the way our minds worked, the way like our intelligence levels, like it was mostly just access to resources that was different. But
Yes,
if they'd had cranes, they would be building with cranes.
yes.
And it's not. I guess I wanna make sure that we don't think of people as
Hmm.
primitive thinkers.
That's
Uh,
exactly it. Like honestly, like the same flexes we do today is so if you wanted to show status back in ancient Egypt, you would have your coffins made by the specific wood. Fuck, what was that wood? It's from Lebanon. It's a very rich wood that they always would do. It's not pine. But the thing is sycamore? No, they have in Egypt abundance of sycamore trees, which sycamore trees they are very knotted and whatnot.
mhm.
So like they're not great to build long coffins with. So people would make the interior part of their coffin of that poor sycamore wood, and then have a very thin layer of this very expensive wood outside to trick both
Yeah.
others and the gods that somehow, no, 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 I was rich. So like like even that flex, like we know people today that do that.
Oh yeah.
Like the grifting has been a science all over
Yeah.
from many a millennia.
I've seen the photos of Mar-a-Lago. I
Yes,
know
yes.
I know what it looks like in that trash pile.
Yes. So like we are not that different from
No.
the people back then.
People have always been people.
Mhm.
Speaking of flex, speaking of historical weirdness, we jump from the painting of the Sistine Chapel to
America?
a storybook picture of the quote unquote first quote unquote Thanksgiving featuring
Mhm.
the quote unquote native tribes who all get along with the pilgrims.
Yep, and they hunt wild turkey and they plant corn. Um I do I love this like also too like I only just recently learned that the Puritans were kicked out of England not because of religious freedom but because they were crazy.
Everyone hated them.
Everyone hated.
It was the beginning of the witch.
Yes.
They were like, you're too much for even us.
Yes, and they
Yeah,
were too much even for here. Uh, the Salem witch trials. That's an episode in my thesis podcast, and it's like, oh, they stopped because they went for the governor's wife, and the governor was like, we need to stop this.
also,
um,
Salem witch trials didn't take place all the way in Salem. Like it
nope,
was, yeah,
nope.
Just-
It's the surrounding areas too, where
yeah. It was kind of all over the. Yeah, I just yeah. Also Puritans weren't the only people on that boat. They
nope, nope.
people on that boat weren't crazy about the Puritans.
No, was it Miles Standish? I should know these things because I did Puritan Pilgrim field schools. Uh, he's one of the pilgrims that probably would have been here in the scene, like hanging out theoretically if this actually ever happened.
So
Um,
yeah, this is wild because the narration says ships sailed across the sea, reached the Americas. No one in Europe knew about this vast new world. Before
yeah,
long, settlers arrived. Among them were the Pilgrims from England. They called the native tribes who lived there Indians and needed their help to hunt wild turkey and plant corn. After the first harvest, the Indians joined the Pilgrims in a feast. The very first Thanksgiving. That's a wild like summation of that
yes.
period of
We're
time.
ignoring there's no Bear Christopher Columbus. There's no, or anything. But somehow ships came and then like we're assuming that Europe did not know this existed even though they put ships out there. Um and then settlers came.
And I'm looking at the picture of the bear sitting at the head of the table, and I don't know enough about Native American
Mm,
traditional garb to say anything about this other than it looks like Mike did some homework because
yes.
it's certainly not drawn. It's not a cartoon it's not a
No.
1950s cartoon representation of a Native American. He's put some thought into however this gentleman is dressed.
Yes, he is definitely this does look like it's an allusion to Algonquin people which had
Okay.
a lot of not peacock quail feathers and a lot of porcupine frills or
Quills?
like
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, a lot of that and I think he's definitely alluding to like, oh, these pilgrims and indigenous people were already kind of like intertrading, so he's wearing some shirts and whatnot instead of like just full skins or something like that. This would have been the Mashpee Wampanoag most likely, theoretically, if there was a Thanksgiving. But the first
Right.
interactions with pilgrims and early settlers in the New England area were with the Mashpee Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. By the time the pilgrims came, the Massachusetts tribe was already like decimated from a disease,
Yeah.
from contact with settlers, or like early traders, because there is evidence at least there was early trading before the pilgrims actually like were like, we're gonna just hang out here. And a lot of them had integrated a lot of Massachusetts people integrated with other nearby tribes of people. And also too like it's interesting, Papa Bear took off his hat as if this was like a very important ceremony.
Yeah.
Like that was the first thing I noticed.
But no one else did.
No one else did, no. And that's why I was kind of like, that's an interesting choice.
Right. It's kind of like he's choosing a sort of the concept of taking off your hat when you sit down to He
Hmm.
is a very specific cultural like gesture,
Hmm.
and he's not reading the room, I guess, because no one else is doing it. It is very funny to notice. Not even Mama has taken off her hat.
No, and also very on Thanksgiving, like the kids are just sitting at the big boy table. Like that's not
That's true.
I mean, historically in my household, we had a kids table and then we had like the regular people's table apparently.
Yeah.
And I hated being at the kids table.
See, I liked being at the kids' table because the adults are always talking about politics, and
Yeah,
I
or
just wanted to
sports.
talk. I just wanted to talk about what I'd watched on TV the day before.
I think I hated it because I had to babysit because
See,
I'm like the middle cousin essentially like
mm-hmm.
in a long line of like 15 cousins essentially. Like I'm smack in the middle.
Ah,
And so like the older kids were either like, "Oh, I'm going to a friend's house instead for
oh,
Thanksgiving,"
okay,
which is like, okay, I guess once you turn 16 or something like that, you get a rite of passage or whatever, and you don't
yeah,
have to hang out with your family. Though as in like in a very Portuguese Catholic home, that's kind of like no. uh
right.
no. And then I'm also expected to take care of all the little children and not enjoy most things.
See, our family, we had a bunch of cousins. We were all roughly the same age,
Mm,
but we
mm,
did have who I think of as my cousins were actually my
mhm.
second cousins, because we had the thing
Yeah.
where like I have cousins who were roughly the same age as my parents,
Mhm,
because my mom's sister had kids when she was still a child,
mhm.
basically, and then so those kids were just a little younger than my mom, and then their kids were roughly my sister and my age. So yeah,
Oh yeah.
we were all just sitting at the kids' table.
Yeah, and that's the same thing too. Like a 15, I'm including my second cousins in there too
Okay.
because they are essentially directly linked. In terms of like the weird sort of Latinx kind of thinking of like, oh yeah, like that's so and so who is like your fifth cousin, but like okay, you like now we can do family things with so
Yeah.
and we regard them as family. So yeah, like that is a very typical thing. And so and I was amused that the kids were allowed to sit at the big boy table, which was like uh
I don't even know if the concept of that existed back in 400 years
you know
ago.
what? Actually, I heard that like at least when I was looking at the Puritan stuff for Salem, like children were basically treated like slaves in that society of like
Don't doubt it.
they were like you don't exist until you are of a certain age and you're expected to do all this stuff. And so I'm like, no wonder those girls were just like, I'm just gonna go crazy. Like,
Right. I'm just going to scream and point at moles,
yep,
and at the end of the day somebody's going to get pressed under a bunch of stones.
yes.
Yeah. We
With
don't get that in the Berenstain Bears book, though.
no, no.
We
But then
do know that Salem exists. They
yes,
have mentioned Salem in the past.
I
Like
remember
that
that.
happened. So
Um and then we very quick like again only 2 points of my American history we care about: Thanksgiving, American Revolution. Like nothing
American.
happened
Yep.
between. Nothing happened between. I do like the British war people, and I also like the I guess that's supposed to be George Washington again on a horse with a
Yeah.
sword. Just saying.
Where it should
Th-
be Washington like sweating in his tent, fumbling with a bunch of like plans, because
yes.
not the greatest tactician in the history of America.
Oh no.
Yeah.
And
Also, yeah.
I was gonna say, and definitely like both as a tactician, but also as like, wow, like here I have like so the Iroquois Confederacy was around this time, and so it's made up of the Oneida, the Mohawk,
Mm,
um, I'm gonna butcher the other tribes. I'm gonna quickly look, but basically, the Oneida were like, hey, George Washington, we will help you with your thing. However, some other clans in the Iroquois Confederacy sided with the British. And instead of being like understanding that, okay, we are a group of people that we are affiliated with each other, but what their decision happens doesn't really affect our decision. And
mm,
so we're separate. After the war, George Washington was like, "Oh no, I'm burning everyone." So like the people
mm.
that helped me, that like fed me and clothed me through the war and also fought in my battles, I'm also going to destroy their land. So like this idea of like not a great tactician, but also not a great diplomacy, like,
No,
and
it's a
he's our
good thing though
first
that that
president.
never happened again in the history of America. It's a good thing that this was the last time we ever
Yep.
did something like that to our allies in a war.
Yes.
Uh,
Totally.
I do have to say So they call him George Washington in this. Now, of course, we know
Mhm.
from past Bear books that I think is George Grislington, I think is who we've seen in the
Oh,
past. So again,
yes.
alternate timeline. Also, George Washington came to power. His family were big slave owners. He was a
Hmm.
slave owner. That's how they made their money. That's kind of
Yep.
how he got where he was. Again, he wasn't the greatest, smartest guy. He failed upwards a lot
Yes. Yeah.
with the lack of chattel slavery, the African slave trade
Hmm.
in this timeline. I'm just wondering who this George Washington was. Like maybe he was a
Yeah.
better fighter. Maybe this was a guy who grew up actually having to work for a living.
Like a Rambo type maybe or something. Like
Yeah.
what if he was? Like what if he or super soldier.
He was a super
He was
soldier.
he
I'm
was the
gonna say
first
this.
Captain America.
His soldiers, good trigger discipline.
Yep. Yep.
Their fingers are not on their the British have their fingers on their triggers.
Yep.
The Americans do not have fingers on their triggers. They're waiting for the command from their general. So
Was
maybe their clothes are clean. These are good uniforms. That's not
no.
the American Revolution that actually got fought. So
No, because we did militia warfare or something like that. Not militia, guerrilla warfare. Like the British were too busy. We have to stand in a line and march in a
yes,
line. Uh, and
which we
and
see.
which we see. We definitely see the formation. We also see it is alluding to that. I also like the very concerned drummer boy in the very back. But
He's like,
like
oh, bullets don't care about the fact that I don't have a gun.
yeah, they don't. They really don't. And these are muskets. These are not like the most accurate weapons.
Right, and they're gonna do
Um,
some damage.
I think it's like a 30-degree like left or right possible difference because the bullets themselves were not as like symmetrical.
Yeah. Oh,
That
yeah.
that was the degree of difference. So like you aimed for the big body parts because you were at least assured that you would hit
Yeah.
those.
Yeah. You
Um
you hoped you got their horse out from under them, and then you went in with the
yes.
bayonet. Like
Yes.
that was kind of the way it worked at times. I also want to point out the real comedy of this book is that this is the third or fourth time actual factual has put the bears' lives in danger because
Yes.
they were in the middle of a barbarian invasion at one point, and now
Yep.
they're cowering behind a wall, trying not to get hit by the bullets flying overhead.
I would also say the boat also high
Oh
risk.
yeah,
High risk.
yeah.
Can the bears? I think we do know they swim. I think there was a whole swimming thing.
They can swim, but they also have a toddler with them, which is
Yeah,
yeah.
which a toddler going overboard with happy dolphins does not make for a happy time.
Nope. A toddler being thrown into the middle of a battle of the American Revolution, also not a happy time.
No,
Mike
uh,
makes it very clear this is a life or death situation.
indeed. And and again, he does call this out as the United States of America. So
Yeah.
like it is a whole
Not
thing.
yeah,
Oh, was it the Revolutionary War or was it the Civil War? They were like, you don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes or something like that.
that's Revolutionary
That's a
War.
revolution. Yeah, so like I
Yeah.
think that trigger discipline is happening because like
Mhm.
they were told that. Like so again,
Yeah.
this is definitely our adjacent timeline. That's separate from the Berenstain Bears. Uh,
Yeah, because we also know that the Bear Declaration of Independence, which is called the Bear Declaration of Independence, was signed later than it was in American history, probably for different reasons. Again, no
mhm.
slave states, so the call for independence was probably followed a very different path than it
Mhm.
did in our history.
Is there a Bear Nicolas Cage to steal said Bear Declaration of Independence?
I hope so. We
I
know that
I
we
need
know
the
there's a
spit-off.
bear. We know there's a bear, Barry Manilow. His name is
Yes.
Barry Manilow.
Yep.
Which we know they have parallels for most of our popular film franchises.
Hmm.
So is there a National Treasure film
Oh,
franchise?
I wish.
Yeah.
I'm I know I sound so nostalgic. I would love that.
Is there a Night at the Museum sequel set in the Bearsonian?
Oh my God,
Is
yes,
my
yes.
question, where we see all these wax figures come to life.
And that's the thing. He would be one to have like okay, because we know he has a lair, and he has this
Mhm.
machine which we cannot confirm or deny actually goes into a dimensional portal or past.
Right.
I'm still maintaining that this may be theoretically just like a holodeck that like it feels very real.
Yeah.
I think the Berenstein Bears feel that this is actually real. And I think that's what actual factual wants people to
Hmm.
think. But regardless, like he would have an ancient sort of like weird abacus looking thing from the movie. The tiles flip over, or
Yes.
or it feels like Guess Who, like the flippy
Oh,
nature of
oh
that
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It feels like that. So like an old Guess Who panel made of gold, like that somehow cursed the entire thing.
Yeah, we have to remember that Actual Factual, once upon a time, built a sentient robot in his lab that, in the end of the story, he killed because he
Mhm.
decided it had no reason, had no right to existence, and then he buried the robot in a grave in the back of the museum. It's in a grave with a headstone that says like, "Here lies Robo, you had no right to life," or something. I don't know what it says, but like,
That says a lot about like anthropomorphizing robots, which one, dangerous. And you famously know my fear of robots.
mm-hmm.
You and Park both love tormenting me about my fear of robots. And you know what? I kind of now agree with actual factual. Yeah, no, they don't have a right to
Don't have
exist.
a right to exist.
No,
Bury them in an unmarked
it's
grave.
a very Frankenstein kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we know famously what happened with that story. You
Yeah,
know, Frankenstein did
got
kill.
got a great bunch of movies based on it.
Hmm.
So then it ends. Like,
Yeah,
we're in the American Revolution, and then he's like, "Oh, time to go home."
today.
Yeah,
And again, it implies this nebulous nature of like, because again, any time, any year is very vague, and it does
yeah,
imply this again, the whole dimensional portal idea that we have. The today is obviously their time, but I also do wonder, is this an ominous telling? Because he does say like it's in the ancient times, the birth of our own country. Did he, if this is not a holodeck situation, did he bring them to this timeline? Like, is
oh.
it kind of like a weird, like, like almost on a horror story kind of way? Very Asimov, like Isaac Asimov kind of way.
Well, look at Mama and Papa's faces. Like,
Yeah.
they're not. I mean, I get that the joke is supposed to be the kids are going to dig up their backyard now looking
Yes.
for treasures, but it might also be like Papa being like, "We need to talk to the kids about what they just saw." Like,
Yeah.
this was
They just saw a lot of shit.
yeah, this I don't think Honey was ready to see a man get murdered in the Coliseum. Like,
Yes.
that's a bit much.
Yeah.
Like that American Revolution battlefield, just that's ugly warfare. It's also interesting that he chose to end their trip now, because it would have required them to go forward into the era of the Civil War, which, as we
Yes.
know, has been covered as the Great Bear War in these books, which
Mhm.
was fought, basically was a Hatfields and McCoys elevated to a million in this timeline. So yeah, again, it wasn't state versus state; it was clan versus clan.
So, and it
Uh,
wasn't about slave
d-
rights. Yeah.
Definitely not. It was about the Bears versus the Grizzlies,
Oh.
and that just took over the nation.
Mhm.
It still had like Stonewall Jackson and all of them, but they were fighting for very different reasons. So I guess Mike was like, you know what, we're not going to get into
We're not gonna
like
get.
that gets
We're also
messy.
not gonna go
So
into world wars. Not at all. No.
not at all,
Not
because
at
oh
all.
boy, we don't want to have to talk about the bomb. We
Yeah.
don't want to have to talk about how World War II led into Korea, led
Yep.
into
Yep.
Vietnam. Like, that's complicated.
That's complicated. And we also, you know what? Honey probably saw that horse. Like, and honestly, Honey feels like a horse girl.
Yes.
And I think George Washington's horse would have died in that scene.
Yeah. Probably got
Eh,
shot out from under him.
Probably shot at from after. That would have been traumatizing. But
Oh yeah.
to a horse girl especially.
Especially with someone as clueless as Actual Factual, who's probably like, we're
Yeah.
going to walk through the medical area where they're
Yes.
tending to the soldiers, and you just hear screaming and sawing.
Yes.
Like, that's
Yep.
uh but that is the Berenstain Bears, long ago. Final thoughts, Dan, on this book?
Final thoughts. Again, I think I'm gonna stick with this idea that if this is not a holodeck situation, actual factual has just now created an Isaac Asimov sort of moralist story ending that's dystopian in a way that
Yes.
I think he has now dropped them off in this weird parallel universe. And I kind of would like to see them meet their other selves.
Oh.
That would be kind of fun.
Uh-huh.
But no, it's pretty funny, and like honestly, as an introduction to kids, like like I'm thinking about like why did I want to become an archaeologist? And a lot of people do admittedly say Indiana Jones. Actually, it was Tomb Raider for me.
Ooh.
Yeah, I had Indiana Jones, but like Tomb Raider was like, oh no, she has guns.
She does
Um,
flips.
she does flips, and if you hold, I actually just got the my boyfriend lovingly gave me for my for Valentine's Day the re-release of the old first three.
Oh
Uh
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
Where
it is kind of
you can switch back and forth between
the
the
remix,
aesthetics.
yeah, the aesthetics. Though the technically Crystal Dynamics did do a remake of the first one, which I kind of like a little bit better. You could also switch between the old mechanics and the new one, and I'm like, damn it,
Mhm.
I had to press all these buttons in order to do something, and now like kind of like the Revolutionary War. This is not Call of Duty, no scoping.
Right.
This is hard war going on. And the other thing too is the like this book had a whole racism disclaimer like
Yes.
yeah, we were kind of racist in the second and third game and maybe the first one too.
Yeah.
um just so you know,
Right.
and there's a supposedly French guy who is very French, if you know what we mean. And similarly, I think the third one takes place, or the second one takes place with a Chinese artifact and story.
Yeah.
Um, and and so yeah, not that I think that the racism warning should have happened in this book or whatever, but it is kind of like we're skipping over a lot.
Right. Plus, the warning would have had to have been. So when I wrote this a year ago,
Yeah.
like this book is from 2018 or 2017. I can't remember which now, but it's this is a more recent Berenstain Bears
Yeah.
book, and it's one of the books that I consider like a jumping off point. Like if you want to start talking about some of this stuff with your kids and you have a little bit of knowledge to impart, it's one of those books where you can show them a page and be like, let's talk about what's going on here,
Hmm.
and let's talk about like what do you think happened here, and let's look at some books that actually have a little more in like a depth for
Yeah.
kids. Uh,
And I think too, archaeology, like unfortunately, there are so many people who do go around randomly digging
hmm,
on sites. Some that and this is the thing too, is like at least in the state of Massachusetts, we keep archaeological records very clock like tight because we don't want people going around finding out where we've dug in the past because there could still be things there.
yeah,
And notoriously, there's always people digging something, and unfortunately, keeping said things, which is like an ethical situation of itself, but also the selling of these kind of goods is like not great. Not that the plastic bowl would probably go for anything.
right,
Again, maybe thousands of years from now, that would be like on eBay, like antique,
yeah,
antique plastic bowl, from Amazon, or they would probably be like Amazon, like they wouldn't know how
right.
to pronounce it.
Or from our godlike overlords,
Yeah,
Amazon.
yeah. I do joke that I think people in the future will think Dunkin' Donuts was somehow a temple, and the drive-through is like the
Hey,
whole thing.
I'm
Yeah.
from the world of White Castle, so there were literally white castles on the on street corners here.
Yes. Um, And so, like, yeah, like I guess I would impart if you're going to tell your children about this, or if they have an interest in archaeology, making sure that they know that there's like a lot of issues that go into archaeology, and that randomly digging is probably fine in our backyard,
Hmm.
but if you do accidentally find something, contact your local preservation offices, and or you know what, if you don't want the hassle, just stop digging.
Just stop.
Just stop digging. Don't say anything. Don't do anything. Don't sell anything.
Yeah.
Even though we don't really enforce it in America, in Europe they enforce it hard.
Oh yeah, I've seen those stories.
When I was in Italy, we had a whole thing of like, yeah, no, like the SWAT team of Italy goes after people if they're selling something on eBay.
Wow. Good. Good. Well, speaking of SWAT teams, I guess, Dan, where can our listeners find you?
So yes, actually, I'm mostly popular on Instagram. By popular, I mean, it's where I tell people, my funders who help fund my research, like, oh, I'm actually doing things. So
Mm-hmm.
here you go. It's at Dan Does Research. And that's probably the best way to find me. And look at things that I'm currently researching, or my thesis is coming out eventually soon, which is also a podcast. When you get to go to an Ivy League, you get to do a lot of stupid things, apparently. So my thesis is a podcast about death and the intersection of cultural heritage, and yeah, the ethics therein. So that'd probably be the best way. At Dan Does
Awesome.
Research.
At Dan Does Research. Well, if you want to find me, you're already here. I also have a podcast called Pizza Toast, which I do with Christy Admiral, which we're about to, at some point, we're going to pick up again and start doing the entire Freaky Friday series.
Ooh,
All the books, all the movies, even the musical.
there's a
I also
musical?
do, yeah, there's a musical and they made a movie of it.
Oh,
So yeah, it's out there. I know, Freaky Friday. We're gonna get knee deep into Mary Rogers.
nice.
And then I also have a podcast called It's Del Toro Time I do with my daughter Willow, where we're currently working our way through the Dark Descent. We're about to finish Fabulous Formless Darkness, and then we'll get back into movies. I think we have an Albert Brooks film coming up. So
Nice.
there you go. That's where you find me. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me this
Thank
week.
you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
It's great seeing you, and again, thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, just my ultimate pleasure. And for everyone out there, I will see you all next time deep in Bear Country.